a climate of intimidation was settling over the nation. A climate that was to radicalize the idealistic young schoolteacher, Ida B. Wells. In much of the South, segregation was fast becoming the law of the land. Wells, who had been exposed to the ideas of freedom and democracy, was not about to accept the new order.
One day, while riding back to my school, I took a seat in the ladies' coach of the train as usual. When the train started and the conductor came along to collect tickets, he took my ticket, then handed it back to me and told me I would have to go in the other car. I refused, saying that the forward car was a smoker. And as I was in the ladies' car, I proposed to stay. He tried to drag me out of the seat, but the moment he caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand.
She fought. They had to bring in, I believe, 2 other conductors. And they physically took her off of that train. And when she's thrown off the train, even more humiliating is that the rest of the white passengers applaud.
Now virtually powerless, most black Americans believed they had no choice but to buckle under to the forces of segregation. But not 22-year-old Wells. She brought suit against the railroad and was awarded $500 in damages. The case was widely reported and celebrated by black people throughout the nation. But the railroad took the case to appeal. In 1887, the state Supreme Court reversed the decision.
Judgment reversed.
Wells had lost her fight. She made the following entry in her diary.
I had hoped for such great things from my suit for my people generally. I firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would, when we appealed to it, give us justice. I feel shorn of that relief and utterly discouraged. And just now, if it were possible, would gather my race in my arms and fly away with them.
Despair gave way to fury. Wells wrote articles about her case that were published by the local papers and then by the leading black newspapers throughout the country.
She had to tell that story basically herself. She saw what that would do. There were a lot of black newspapers beginning to emerge, and a lot of them had been created by churches and by black religious organizations. The black church, of course, was independent. The black church didn't have to answer to any great degree to white owners.
And as a result of that, it's really the beginning of her career as a journalist. So it's important historically, but also important in terms of her own life. You see now there's a focus on it and a new kind of determination. She had found the meaning of her life, which was in her work as a journalist.
Signing her weekly column, Viola, Wells advocated self-help, education, and social reform. After exposing corruption and poor conditions in the Memphis school system, she lost her teaching job and became a full-time journalist.
She was called by other black journalists the princess of the press. And you get the very strong impression from the historical, what there is available, of historical record, that whenever Ida Wells showed up at a meeting of black journalists, that she was kind of the highlight. She was apparently a very personable woman, as well as being a very beautiful woman, a very bright woman.
Wells soon became editor and a co-owner of the newspaper Free Speech. She now found herself writing about issues she had read about as a child: racism and power. Blacks were attempting to gain power. Whites were unwilling to share it.
Over here across the river in Marion, Arkansas, in 1888, there was a big incident. The county had been ruled by or governed by elected black officials ever since Reconstruction. But that year, the whites rented about 1,000 Winchesters from Memphis, and they marched to the office of all of the black officials and said, no, the county's not big enough for you and us, and we got a one-way ticket for you to Memphis, and don't come back. So they marched them down to the railroad and put them on the train to Memphis. The governor in Arkansas said there's nothing he could do about it. Said if the people didn't want black officials, why, he couldn't do anything about it.
For black people, law and order was collapsing. Police not only tolerated, but in some cases even participated in mob violence. Lynch law was deliberately used to terrorize black Americans. Pamphlets like this incited more violence. This was the situation in 1892 when three young black men, Will Stewart, Calvin McDowell, and Thomas Moss, friends of Ida Wells, opened a grocery store in direct competition with a white-owned grocery across the street.
The white grocer didn't like it much, and so there was a bad blood between the white grocer and the black grocery store. He went to the city officials and tried to get them to, or the county officials tried to get them to close it down, said that they were maintaining a nuisance. They were selling beer. And when the deputy sheriffs arrived, now they didn't have uniforms. They were in plain clothes. It was after dark. Now you see some white folks with guns coming after you. Why, blacks fired on them. You had gunfire, and a deputy was wounded. At that point, the truth must have come out, and so the blacks stopped firing, and the deputies went in and arrested all they could find in the grocery store. Then they went out and arrested everybody in the neighborhood they could find. And so they threw 20 to 30 people in jail.
Within hours, rumors of a black revolt spread throughout the county. A black militia was disarmed. The three grocers were dragged from their cells by a mob and murdered. The killers were never brought to justice.
Everybody in town knew and loved Tommy. An exemplary young man. He was married and the father of one little girl, Maureen, whose godmother I was. He and his wife, Betty, were the best friends I had in town. He owned his little home, and having saved his money, he went into the grocery business with the same ambition a young white man would have had. One of the morning papers held back its edition in order to supply its readers with the details of that lynching. It said that Thomas Moss begged for his life for the sake of his wife and his child and his unborn baby. That Calvin McDowell got hold of one of the guns of the lynchers, and because they couldn't loosen his grip, a shot was fired into his closed fist. There's a strong belief among us that the criminal court judge himself was one of the lynchers.
The black community of Memphis was stunned. Wells retaliated with her pen. She wrote an editorial.
The city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. The white mob could help itself to ammunition without pay, but the order was rigidly enforced against the selling of guns to Negroes.
This is something that touched her not just as a woman who was sensitive to the injustices were being imposed upon blacks, but there was a personal note in it all that I think forced her to ask the question, am I willing to stand up to whoever may oppose me in trying to, in fighting for racial justice?
Wells chose to fight. She also chose her weapons.
There's therefore only one thing left that we can do. Save our money and leave a town, which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but takes us out and murders us in cold blood when accused by white persons. Hundreds disposed of their property and left. Leading pastors took their whole congregations with them as they, too, went west.
She said, leave. You know, this is that black migration to the Middle West, the Kansas and Oklahoma migration. Go to Kansas, go to Oklahoma. And many blacks left. And I think that's another reason that the power structure was angry with her, because she understood the economic and political strategy that they were using to intimidate blacks. And what she was saying is, you don't have to stay here and be intimidated, leave.
And so the white businesses were in a panic that blacks had left. They were buying everything on the installment plan, and they just left everything. So the people were left. The restaurants were going out of business, because all the black patronage was going. And you talk about the power of the pen and of her leadership to be the force behind thousands of black people leaving, and whatever Memphis represented to them was the only thing that they knew. It was where their roots were, where they were working, was where their families were. And 6,000 people packed up their bags, went to the Oklahoma Territory. Of course, Ida Wells had gone there previously to sort of scout the place. To get black people to leave everything and go to a place that's unknown. They don't know anything that's out there. The weather is different, the circumstances are different. You know, the towns are, many of them yet to be established. And she did that when she was just a young woman.
Among those who remained in Memphis, Wells helped to organize a boycott aimed at the newly installed trolley system.
6 weeks after the lynching of Thomas Moss and his partners, the superintendent and treasurer of the City Railroad Company came into the office of the Free Speech and asked us to use our influence with the colored people to get them to ride on the streetcars again. When I asked why they came to us, the reply was that colored people had been their best patrons and that there had been a marked falling off of their patronage. I asked them what they thought was the cause. They said they didn't know. They had heard Negroes were afraid of electricity. When they left the office, I wrote this interview for the Free Speech and told the people to keep up the good work and to keep on staying off the cars.
She moved to a strategy of organizing, that she wanted to mobilize black people, women's groups in particular, but other kinds of black mobilization, which signaled that it wasn't only a matter of the mirror image. You don't just get people to see that they're wrong and then change. She saw that you had to get some organizational apparatus in place.
Wells used her paper to campaign against the growing number of lynchings, some involving mobs as large as 10,000 people. She described the carnival-like atmosphere in which black men, women, and children were hanged, shot, and burned to death for such offenses as non-payment of a debt, insulting whites, even testifying in court.
8 Negroes lynched since last issue of the Free Speech. 3 were charged with killing white men, and 5 with raping white women.
The charge of sexual assault against white women was routinely offered by the press and the authorities as the justification for these atrocities. Wells, at great risk, began to investigate these charges. One after the other proved false.
I also found that what the white man of the South practiced as all right for himself, he assumed to be unthinkable in white women. They could and did fall in love with the pretty mulatto and quadroon girls, as well as the black ones, but they professed an inability to imagine white women doing the same thing with Negro and mulatto men. Whenever they did so and were found out, the cry of rape was raised, and the lowest element of the white South was turned loose to wreak its fiendish cruelty on those too weak to help themselves.
Wells was now digging at the psychological roots of the sexual charges. She wrote an editorial about her findings.
Nobody in this section believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men assault white women. If Southern white men are not more careful, they will overreach themselves, and a conclusion will be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women.
Wells was raising an unspeakable issue, suggesting voluntary relationships between white women and black men. It was an inflammatory idea. Outraged, the white press of Memphis rushed to the defense of white womanhood. Edward Ward Carmack, the fiery editor of the Memphis Commercial, led the attack, claiming that the black sets aside all fear of death for the gratification of his bestial desires. The Evening Scimitar had even more to say on the subject.
If the Negroes themselves do not apply the remedy without delay, it will be the duty of those whom he has attacked. Again, they're assuming that the writer of these editorials is one of the men associated with Ida Wells, to tie the wretch who utters these calumnies to a stake at the intersection of Main and Madison Streets, brand him in the forehead with a hot iron, and perform upon him a surgical operation with a pair of tailor's shears. Well, it's perfectly obvious what they were talking about there.
I bought a pistol the first thing after my friend Tom Moss was lynched, because I expected some cowardly retaliation from the lynchers. I felt that one had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or rat in a trap. I'd already determined to sell my life as dearly as possible if attacked. I felt if I could take one lyncher with me, this would even up the score a little bit.
Wells was on a train headed for a conference in the East when the uproar over her editorial occurred. In New York, she learned that a committee of leading citizens had marched to her office, smashed the presses, and destroyed everything they could find. With a price on her head, Wells was now in exile. It would be 30 years before she would return to the South.